On a campus where it's very difficult to attract a crowd, to draw the kind of audience that you're looking for, it's wonderful to see so many colleagues, students, administrative staff, faculty, members of the Boston College community coming out today for what I very much hope will be the beginning of a semester-long conversation about crucial issues related to race and justice in the contemporary United States. I'm thankful to many, those in the audience, as I pointed out, thankful to my 5 colleagues up front to have faculty leadership on the issues that have grabbed hold of our local and national imagination over the last few months. I'm mindful of the Globe piece that Dean Rougeau put forth back in late November, which was a very thoughtful Boston College intervention at a moment of great crisis nationally with regard to questions of race and justice. To have faculty voices helping to launch the conversation today and across the semester is as much as I, as provost, could hope for, and I look forward to the comments that they offer up at the beginning of the session, the questions, the reactions from the audience, and I look forward to additional events that the departments, schools, institutes, centers, and other groups on campus are going to be putting forward across these next few weeks and months as we as a community grapple with individual and collective responses and responsibility to the questions of race, justice, and injustice that came so powerfully to the fore this past November and December. Before turning it over to Jim Keenan from the Jesuit Institute, let me offer my particular thanks to Jim and his colleague Tony Ross, who put together so much of the work that went into drawing this audience, putting together this all-star panel, and letting the campus know that this would be the first of our responses this semester. Jim has a wonderful feel for the academic community on this campus, the ways in which we can think seriously about very pressing and ethical concerns, and it was a pleasure working with Tony and especially Jim in putting this together. So on that note, let me turn it over to Father Jim Keenan of the Theology Department and the Jesuit Institute.
Over the past couple of years, I've been working on the phenomenon of how people invoke conscience in the United States and how they invoke conscience in Europe. And I found an enormous difference. In Europe, Roman Catholics began to invoke conscience after the war. Out of the destruction and the horror of what had happened during the Second World War, Germans in particular began to ask how could they, as Catholics, be so involved in such awful activities. And they had this examination of conscience that went on in which the people of Germany constantly today will talk about their remorse, about something that they participated in, and in a way that was like a birth of conscience. It happened in France, it happened in Poland, it happened across Europe where we see regularly moral theologians from all these countries daily talking about conscience, and they have this robust notion that was born out of remorse, out of contrition, and out of a recognition of how terribly sinful people can be. In the United States, after the Second World War, we were quite happy with ourselves. We returned very obedient to different structures, managed to elect a general as a president. We managed to move forward with great discipline. We liked authority, we stayed with it. Conscience only became invoked by Roman Catholics in 1968 when the birth control encyclical came out. And then they began to talk about dissent from a teaching. There were also those who were objecting to the Vietnam War. They too invoked dissent, but they never talked in a robust way about conscience as anything other than opting out, other than dissenting. Today, we can see our bishops talking about Obamacare, and they take the same approach, dissenting. They invoke the conscience clause. This is how Americans usually use conscience, not in any robust way, not in any particular way other than to talk about a prerogative that I have to follow what I believe is true as opposed to what the authorities may say. It's a fairly infantilized notion of conscience, I think. And I kept looking, well, why is that? And one of the main reasons is the conscience in the United States has never been born out of any of the remorse that we find in most other cultures. That conscience is usually born in a person, in an awakening of how bad we can really be, that we realize a call to responsibility, in part because of what we have done. And in the United States, we have what we call an original sin, something that Obama, something that Jim Wallis have referred to as original sin. It's race. and the history of race and the history of slavery in this country and the near genocidal destruction of the Native American peoples are indications of how there has never been an examination of conscience in any enduring, any stunning way that we find in other cultures. And I do think that that needs to be addressed. I found for myself a way of looking at it by looking at a book by one of my colleagues, Sean Copeland, a book that she wrote, came out in 2010, Enfleshing Freedom, Body, Race, and Being. And in the very beginning, she says, "We Christian theologians in the United States work in a house haunted by the ghost of slavery, in a country at once enthralled and impoverished by the dazzling innovations of technical rationality. The political memory of the nation suppresses our deep entanglement in slavery. Without the painstaking, thorough, and passionately dispassionate intellectual courage of women and men of all races, the nation might have gone on overlooking the bodies piled up outside the door, gone on concealing slavery behind narratives of innocence and mask of pretense." That's what I learned from one of my colleagues, and in thinking of putting this together, I thought that we should bring in more colleagues, that we should have more faculty involved in the discussion about race on this campus. And so the way we're going to proceed is each one is going to be speaking for about 7 or 8 minutes, and at the end, as each speaks, and in the order that they're seated, which is the alphabetical order of their names, which I'm going to introduce in a second, after they each, all 5 finish, then we will open it up for questions. We're hoping that the first section goes for about 50 minutes, and that will leave us a good 40 minutes at the end. So let me introduce the 5 speakers. Gustavo Morelos is a Jesuit. He's an assistant professor of sociology here at Boston College. He works on the relations between Catholics and society in Argentina and Latin America's recent history. His last book, coming out in July 2015, is The Catholic Church and Argentina's Dirty War. Nancy Pineda Madrid is Associate Professor of Theology and Latino Ministry at Boston College's School of Theology and Ministry. Her published work includes her book, Suffering and Salvation in Ciudad Juarez by Fortress Press, and a book she co-edited, Hope, Promise, Possibility, and Fulfillment with Paulus Press, as well as numerous articles addressing questions of soteriology, suffering, religious symbols, popular Catholicism, and Latina theology. Vince Rougeau has been the Dean of Boston College Law School since 2011. He has been a strong voice for innovation in legal education and has launched a number of initiatives at the law school to expand experiential education and to raise its global profile. He speaks and writes frequently on law and Catholic social teaching and on immigration and multiculturalism in Europe and North America. Min-Young Song is Professor of English and Director of the Asian American Studies Program. Martin Summers is Associate Professor of History and Director of the African and African Diaspora Studies Program. He is a published scholar in the area of race, gender, and sexuality in American history, and is currently completing a book on race and mental illness in the 19th and 20th century United States. So, Gustavo, it's all yours.
Great. So, I am an Argentinian Jesuit, not the Argentinian Jesuit, another one. I came here 3 years ago to work at the sociology department. My field is sociology of religion. I don't study race or ethnicity. I'm not a specialist on the issue. There are other professors at the department who are doing research and teaching on the topic, and I encourage you, the students who are here, to take these classes about race and ethnicity at the sociology department. My take here is the one of the outsider. Of course, being an outsider doesn't mean I'm neutral. I'm a Jesuit sociologist, and there is a bias in my choice and in my analysis. So I'll tell you 3 things I learned about race this summer, and I want to encourage you to share when the floor is open for questions and answers, one thing that you have learned about race in your life. So I want to encourage you to tell your stories. Short one, 30 seconds, because otherwise we will be kicked out here, but just to tell your stories about race. So 1, I try to start with a joke that we have in Latin America, which is a kind of odd thing to start translating a joke, but there we go. There is a saying among Latin Americans about our cultural heritage that they said that Mexicans descended from the Aztecs, Peruvians descended from the Incas, and Argentinians descending from the boats. Meaning that we perceive ourselves as Europeans. I even have an Italian passport. My grandfather was an Italian, I hold an Italian passport. But when I apply for a US visa and I have to fill the form for the BC job, the box to check was white, non-European, white, no Caucasian, Hispanic, or Latino. So I was an Argentinian for 45 years, and now I am a Latino. And every time I go through customs and migration, I change my identity. I am a new guy, a different guy. So I learned that race is a social construction. It's something that crystallizes social relations at a given time. It's a construction rooted in a particular history. Race is not about biology, but about power relations, hegemonic positions, and establishes roles in a given society. 2, there is discrimination in Argentinian society. If you have the chance to go to a soccer game, you will hear the chants and the songs from the fans, and they usually involve some kind of discriminations against the others. I knew that there is discrimination in the States. I studied that. Both in Argentina and in the States, I've overheard conversations about them and us, and the difference that exists between them and us. The ones who were part of the deviant group have changed, but discrimination is a pervasive social phenomenon. But this summer, things changed for me. After the murders of Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, something happened. I experienced a broad spectrum of reactions from students, colleagues, and Jesuits. Bigotry, ignorance, indifference, and concern, and pain. A lot of pain. I talked with people who have been suffering for a long time, and perhaps because of what had happened, they allow themselves to mourn in public, to express their long sorrow in front of others. Because of this, which was a revelation for me, I decided to suspend the scheduled topic in my syllabus, and I used the classes to have a conversation. What I noticed was that while some students felt threatened, and David, you told it can be me in a class, or surprised, I've never ever imagined that, or drained, I'm exhausted of having to explain why Black Lives Matter. I realized that there are two worlds in our society that rarely interact. And I wonder, how can it be possible that good, honest, clever people don't see the injustice of the system? So I learned that discrimination is different than racism. While discrimination is a personal or collective attitude, racism is a social system that naturalizes discrimination, make it look like normal. Racism is embedded in our life in such a way that we don't see it anymore, like a classroom that is there, we feel it, we use it, but we don't see it as a roof. Most Americans don't believe that race is a problem anymore in daily life. But the question is, for whom race is not an issue anymore? 3, just before Christmas, I met a friend who is working in Atlanta. I'd never been there, at the new Cristo Rey School in that city. 90% of the students are Black, inner city students. Naturally, we talk about the situation in the country, and I asked him about his students at the school. He says that the students talk a lot. They've told him many similar stories that the ones we have seen in the media. But the main difference he saw when compared with other places in the United States is that his students in Atlanta didn't feel threatened. He explained me that in Atlanta, African Americans are in charge of the city. Power is in black hands. And because of that, the perception of what's going on is different. So I learned that this is a discussion about power. This is all about power. It's who has the power, the ability to set the rules in daily life, who has the power to oppress you, who has the power to set you free, who has the power to acknowledge your identity and rights, and who has the factual power to deny them. And as far as I know, there is no case in human history where people in power gave it up voluntarily. Since early times, rights were conquest, not given. People fought for power to challenge the ones who hold it. History is a catalog of many different strategies to struggle for power, for armed revolutions to civil protest. Pacifist movements only succeeded when there is an audience that is willing to support the claim and stand up in solidarity. And my fourth lesson is that I learned that this is my role. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gustavo. I too am very delighted to be here and want to begin with a bit of reflection on my own life and experience. I'm a Mexican-American, a Chicana from the U.S.-Mexican border region, and so certainly that informs what I'm going to share with you today. And as I was thinking about my remarks today, I titled them Border Knowing, Outing Racism and Cultivating a New Consciousness. And I want to launch into that by sharing a little more about my own history. I did my doctoral work in the San Francisco Bay Area. I lived in Berkeley, California for a number of years, and you can't live in Berkeley and not see the evidence and elements of the civil rights movement all around you. The free speech movement, which began in 1964, where students on UC Berkeley's campus wanted to be involved in a political activism that occurred on campus, and the administration didn't want that. And so there was this huge protest that the students organized and transformed it. And then, of course, you see the elements of that to this day with all kinds of different locations in the Berkeley area. And as I think about race today, I also think about a scholar who I studied when I was in Berkeley, Gloria Anzaldúa. She wrote a wonderful book in 1987 entitled Borderlands, La Frontera. And I want to launch what I'm going to say today with a quote from her. She wrote in that book, "The struggle is inner. Chicano, Indio, American Indian, Mojado, Mexicano, immigrant Latino, Anglo in power, working class Anglo, Black, Asian, all our psyches resemble the border towns and are populated by the same people. The struggle has always been inner and is played out in outer terrains. Awareness of our situation must come before inner changes, which in turn comes before changes in society." So these 3 points that she's making: an awareness of our situation, then inner changes, and then finally changes in society. And she concludes this by saying that nothing happens in the real world unless it first happens in the images in our head. So I want to take what Gustavo's given us and extend it a bit more and to say that certainly race is about power, no doubt, but it's also about imagination. And we have to think about what's going on in terms of our imagination. And so my first kind of area of thinking about this, so what are the racial choques? I'm using a term that is a colloquialism along the U.S.-Mexican border, a choque, which I don't imagine maybe a lot of us know that word here. But a choque means a cultural collision. It's It's an accident, it's a confrontation. And when I look at what has happened over the last several months in this country, this pattern of Ferguson and then Staten Island and what's gone on as well in Cleveland and in many different locations, certainly we have an awareness of a choque that's happening on a much, much larger level. And I see, as I read about that and the African-American experience here in this country, I'm also aware of my experience along the U.S.-Mexican border with Latinos who know much, much higher incarceration rates, and certainly that's true along the border, but it's also true here in this part of the country as well as across the country. Immigrants are many times a new class of slaves in our own country. They're not named as slaves, but it's certainly a modern day version of slavery where they don't have any standing, often undocumented immigrants. They don't have standing legally before the law, and so all manner of abuse happens. And these are elements of what you were talking about, a social, racial construction. Sexual trafficking, of course, is another example of it that affects disproportionately the experience of women. And while sexual trafficking is not certainly limited to people of color, women of color, it's disproportionately an experience of women of color. There's a huge militarization that's occurring on the U.S.-Mexican border and an institutionalization of violence, as we hear all kinds of rhetoric about beefing up the border patrol along the border is certainly an example of this. And so I'm pointing all of these out because they're all racial choques, and they're ways that race becomes constructed, certainly in terms of the experience of Latinos. And I want to share with you another quote from Ansaldúa, which I think really helps us to get at that. And she writes, as well in the same book, the U.S.-Mexican border es una herida abierta, where the third world grates against the first and bleeds. Una herida abierta, an open wound. And it continues to be a wound. She goes on, and before a scab forms, it hemorrhages again, the lifeblood of two worlds merging to form a third country, a border culture. Borders are set up to define the places that are safe and unsafe, to distinguish us from them. A border is a dividing line, a narrow strip along a steep edge. A borderland is a vague and undetermined place created by the emotional residue of an unnatural boundary. It is in a constant state of transition. The prohibited and forbidden are its inhabitants. And in many ways, race in this country is very much an element of a border reality, of an us distinguished from them, where the world is safe and where it is unsafe. And certainly when you are along the border, you experience that in a very real way. I grew up seeing border patrol agents and vehicles all along the border, and often being asked, where were you born? And sometimes having Mexican immigration officials insist that I was not a U.S. citizen, but was refusing to claim that I was born in Mexico, even though I was born here. So there's all kinds of tension along race that happens on the border. So where do we go with this? And I want to put out another idea here, a third idea, namely, or a second idea rather, namely that we need to grow in a mythos of carnalismo, another phrase that's often common along the U.S.-Mexican border, carnalismo. Carnalismo has to do with, it comes from the word carnal, which means flesh, right? And so often in Spanish along the border, we'll refer to one another as carnales, or hoy es carnal, hi flesh. There's a recognition here that we're connected to one another. And I think that's where we need to go in terms of responding to the tragedies we know in our own time. How do we begin to see from two different perspectives? How do we appreciate the knowing that comes out of our indigenous and African and Latino and Asian roots? And I see that certainly part of what was going on here at Boston College, a certain affirmation of carnalismo with the student protests that occurred in response to Ferguson, and the protests that have occurred in the last week on I-93 here in Boston, with all kinds of different protesters wanting to insist that we have to pay attention to race. So a border consciousness we need a border consciousness to open us up in some new ways, and to open us to beauty. And I want to end with another quote from Anzaldúa. And she writes, "At some point, our way to a new consciousness, we will have to leave behind the opposite bank, the split between the two mortal combatants, somehow healed, so that we are on both shores at once, and at once see through serpent and eagle eyes, coming from the image of Quetzalcoatl, which is an Aztec god, namely el serpiente emplumado, which means the feathered serpent, right? So a serpent being the image of one that is of the earth, emplumado of divinity. And so we have to be able to see through both of these. And I think she points us in that direction, the direction of a new consciousness. Thank you.
So I'm going to preface my remarks with a couple of comments. First, because I'm a law professor, and we're lawyers and we're very rule-bound on the one hand, but we're lawyers and we're very loquacious on the other hand. So Jim told me it's 7 minutes, and a law professor could inhale for 7 minutes. So I've got to be very conscious of that. And but he also said, well, why don't you organize your thoughts around the 3 themes? So I said, oh, those are the rules. Let me do that. No, but I thought it might be good for me to do that. And actually, it offers a kind of different way of engaging the issues. And what I've done is I've looked at the 3 themes of our panel today: expectations, concerns, and hopes. And I've developed just a few bullet points for each, and I'm going to make a few comments on each. And what I'm hoping to do is to stimulate some thinking. We've had a lot of great comments already, giving us a lot of richness, and I'm going to sort of throw out some more themes, and I hope, by the end of this, maybe these themes will be floating through the room and will help us, gather our thoughts as we try to talk about some of this more deeply. For myself, just by way of a little bit of background, I come from an African-American family that's been in Louisiana and is part of that very mixed tradition of Louisiana, French, Native American, African, and has been there for, since the 18th century. So we have a very kind of deeply embedded understanding of all these issues of race in some very complex ways, and maybe we'll have some more time to talk about that later. Expectations. The way we're understanding race is changing. We are becoming a much more multiracial, multicultural society, and we are going to need some new ways of thinking and talking about race in this country. Our vocabulary around race in the United States has for a very long time been very limited and very stilted, and we're starting to see new challenges. Some of them you've already heard, and I'm sure you're going to hear some more. We need to be thinking very, very carefully about how that conversation is going to move forward as the country changes. A second point, the way we understand race is going to be increasingly bound up with class. Now, if race and slavery are our original sin, class is the American Voldemort. In the early Harry Potter books, you can't say the name. Can't talk about class. But we need to talk about class in this country because the level of income inequality in this nation is absolutely startling. Stunning, and it's getting worse. And it's getting worse not just because of events that are occurring here in the United States, but because of global events. We don't like to talk about it. We pretend it's not a problem. It's a huge problem, and it's really going to affect a lot of the ways we think and talk about race. On top of the issue I just mentioned, this increasing multicultural diversity, what is that going to mean for racial discussions and the way we understand race in the United States? Race, I think, is also going to be understood differently in major metropolitan areas of this country and places where there are lots of large cities and lots of immigration than it's being understood in other parts of the country where things haven't changed quite so quickly. The big political divide in American life is not surprisingly also coterminous with large urban centers being one way politically, and rural areas and states that haven't changed very much being another way politically. In other words, we're living in some different realities. The people in Alabama are still talking about race for the most part in terms of black and white. The people in cities like Boston and New York and Los Angeles probably are not. When you get off of the airplane in Los Angeles, you see a very different country from the one that exists when you get off the airplane in Dallas or in Knoxville. So we need to think a little bit more about how our political issues and our political divisions and some crises that are developing in the way we govern ourselves are also being driven by different racial realities and different realities of how we live. So those are some expectations, concerns. Americans are not sufficiently aware of the past and our shared obligations because of it, and how it shapes our common story. Race and racism are deeply embedded in our history, and these things will not magically disappear. Are we prepared for the ongoing work that is required to deal with this? Now, Jim, in his comments, I think, referred to some of these themes as well. We don't do a good job in American culture of owning our past. We just think that because we weren't involved, I grew up in the North, it's not my problem. My family came on a boat, it's not my problem. It's all of our problems. It's a collective problem. We own our collective history as Americans. We can't pretend that just because we're not from the South or our family didn't own slaves or because our family were immigrants, that it's not a problem that we all share, because we are all influenced by the cultural connections that have developed because of racism in American life and because of our identifications as Americans. And we have to start thinking about that in the same way the Germans think about Nazism and the Poles think about their relationship with the Jews. These things matter, and we have to stop being adolescents as a society when it comes to dealing with our past. So something else that I think is a concern of mine is, how are we going to claim that? How are we going to own it? And how are we going to start engaging it in a way that recognizes that just because we ourselves didn't participate in something, it doesn't mean that we don't have to talk about it and deal with it. We also need to be more willing to understand and explain and deal with the fact that we all benefit from structures and systems that we didn't necessarily create or shape. So this is building a little bit on the last point. Americans have a lot of trouble because we're so individualistic, and we think that to a certain degree that people are in much more control of their lives than they actually are. Now, there's a great tradition in this country of individualism and hard work and building oneself up. But to some extent, that's not necessarily true for everyone. Not everyone is going to be able to pull him or herself up by the bootstraps. And the fact that we still pretend and use that language so easily and so blithely in our political conversations in our public life is a real problem. We've got to get over that nonsense. It is not necessarily true that people have control. What do we do about those that don't? How do we recognize that as a society there are a lot of people here who are just going to be stuck? They're always going to be poor. They are not going to move up. They are not going to necessarily benefit from a better education. That's just a sad reality. It's not something that is pleasant to think about, but if we're thinking about the way the world actually works, we've got to deal with that. We can't keep pretending that if people just work a little bit harder, things are going to get better every time. So how are we going to engage that reality? Third, we're not sufficiently outraged by failures in our political system and our economic life that transcend race but exacerbate racism. The poor and the marginalized are easily divided against themselves, and the rich just get richer. This country is just amazing in its ability to divide the poor. I mean, the fact that racism is such a successful vehicle for making the poor not see what is in their best interest, to making the middle class sometimes not see what's in their best interest, and certainly working people. The fact that there has never been a sort of serious movement across racial and ethnic divisions in this country for a very long time to really get people to join together to engage the real big problems that are facing them around their economic life and their inability to really take advantage of a lot of the wealth that's being generated in this country is something that transcends race, but racism is a great way to make sure that that does not happen. We need to talk about that. Hopes, because there is a happy ending of the story. We have come a tremendously long way in this country, and we need to celebrate the progress we've made. Many of our racial problems have disappeared before our very eyes. Think about how much the country has changed. I had the benefit just a week ago, a week ago my grandmother died. I'm 50 years old, 51 years old, my grandmother was 89, so I knew my grandmother. My children who are here knew their great-grandmother. I have living memory of her telling me stories of how When she and her sisters walked down the street in their town in Louisiana, if they saw girls their own age, they had to step into the mud to let them pass. I mean, that was their reality. That doesn't happen anymore, you know, and that's an important change. I mean, if you talk to her, she would say, whoa, things are way, way better. Things are very much better. They're not all better, but something very significant has changed. And we need to celebrate that change, because just in the same way that we own the bad things, let's own the good things. Let's celebrate the fact that this country has had a huge and serious racial problem. We have finally turned our attention to it over the last few decades, and we're starting to see things get better, but we can't stop there. Now, the US, the second point, will soon become a majority non-white nation. And I hope that this will make race a more complex and less relevant, a more complex issue and less relevant to our interactions with one another. You know, I hope that America will become a better place when we start moving beyond this obsession with black and white and start thinking of ourselves in a more complex way, starting thinking of ourselves as a nation of people with shared values and shared hopes and shared aspirations. But there's still work to do. I think young people will continue to challenge tired and discredited ways of thinking. One of the great happy moments for me in seeing the response to what has been going on nationally in places like Ferguson is the energy of young people behind it. And I think young people need to recognize that you need to work to shape your future. These issues are there for you. You can blame us for making them bad. You can blame us for creating them, but they're yours now. And you're going to have to work with them. And we're here to help you work with them, but you've got to do that work. And I think I'm seeing great signs of your ability to do that, so don't let that ball drop. And then finally, we need to reclaim our political system from those who seek to exploit our racial divisions. There's an old Russian saying that says, people get the government they deserve. Let's hope that's not true. But in as much as it might be true, there is a way out of that morass. We have to look at ourselves and say, we live in a democracy, and we need to engage it and stop complaining about it, because there are a lot of people there in Washington who love the way things are right now and are happy to see us, scrambling in the streets and not really accomplishing much, and just they continue to do what they do. Vote, engage, participate, organize. Those are things that need to be done, because if we actually get out and constantly exercise our right to the franchise, things will have to change, because when you look at the raw numbers, good is on our side. So those are my thoughts, my hopes, my concerns, and my expectations, and I look forward to the conversation.
Yet again, I find myself wishing my last name began with A. So I didn't have to follow these guys. I might cover some of what they've already covered, but I want to focus primarily on the issue of policing, because I think that's an issue that we really need to address. So I want to start with a couple of questions. Is it on?
You have to pull it close.
Oh, okay. What is the nature of police work? What is it like to be an actual police officer? These aren't easy questions to answer, because I think our sense of what an officer does for a living is inevitably affected by the movies, TV shows, novels, video games, maybe the news we've all undoubtedly consumed. For most of us, it's probably safe to say that we are blurry about where entertainment ends and where reality begins. So let me turn to what I know from firsthand observation. It's an imperfect approach, but it's readily available. The reason why I want to start here is because I want to make it clear that what I have to say is not anti-police. Just before Christmas, I was shopping on Newberry Street, and I heard, and a march happened to be coming by, and some man said very loudly, "Oh, it's an anti-police march." And the tone that he used seemed to me to say it all. Why are they protesting? Because they hate the police. Because they hate the society the police defend. Because they don't like white people and rich people, while they perversely embrace criminals and the lawless. So what I want to argue is that the current crisis surrounding police and race is inextricably tied to larger systemic issues, which we've heard some about already, and that these protests are playing an important role in exposing what these ties are. The protests are not about police officers. They are about what policing has become. It's not about who they are, it's about what is happening, about an action. So my direct interactions with the police are pretty limited. I see them directing traffic. I see them guarding road crews while they're doing work. There are a few times when I've been pulled over for speeding, and there were a few memorable incidents I won't go into. I did have to go to the police station a few times because my car got towed, the street was being cleaned, and I forgot to move it. Such a hassle. You have to pay a ticket, and then you have to pay some tow truck for towing your car. Thank you very much. Sometimes I'll see a police car, drive by with sirens on. It's not that often. But it's clear that, that it hints at some of the challenging work that police officers have to do that I don't really get to see firsthand, luckily. So to judge from these encounters, what I can deduce is that police work is pretty dull for the most part. There's a lot of standing around. There's a lot of waiting for time to elapse. There's a lot of bureaucracy. You always see them filling things out. Every once in a while, there's probably some kind of action. But I imagine even this action is surrounded by a lot of standing around and waiting. A lot of boredom, punctuated by emergencies and occasionally by danger. Being a police officer is hard work. It's largely blue-collar physical labor mixed in with little white-collar filling out of forms. I feel a lot of sympathy for police officers in a way that I feel sympathy for delivery truck drivers, sales clerks, nurses. They all work hard for a living, and they are all probably not paid enough for their work. Now, the police officers I've encountered on a one-on-one basis have, for the most part, been professional and courteous. But even still, there's always something that I'm aware of, and I hope that you're aware of as well. When I interact with an officer, the officer has a protective status that I do not have. These interactions are always thus fraught with differential power structures. For one thing, they have a gun, handcuffs, maybe a taser, maybe a baton. They are certainly trained to hurt me very badly if they feel the need to. This automatically means that any encounter with the police has an edge that an encounter with the delivery person or a sales clerk or a nurse doesn't have. I don't think those people can hurt me if they feel the need or that they feel endangered. And police are also protected by their status as members of the police, which means they are officially endowed by the state with the state's exclusive right to use force. In fact, that's a pretty good definition of what a state is. They have the exclusive right to use force. Theoretically, this right is heavily prescribed. But in practice, as we've seen repeatedly for many years, and with a renewed vigor these last few months, prescriptions vary and latitude is wide. In my encounters with the police, things went best when I showed a great deal of deference. I use the word sir or ma'am. I do what they ask me to do right away. I don't argue or disagree or point out flaws in their reasoning. I generally stay as distant from them as possible. And every once in a while, when I think it's safe, I'll give them a nod and they'll nod back at me. Now, on the few occasions when I was much, much younger and didn't practice such deference, I must say the police did not take it very well. Even now, and when I'm a lot older, I find it a challenge to give officers the kind of respect they uniformly demand. It's not that I think they don't deserve the respect. What's challenging is the demand. There's a feeling of powerlessness that comes with giving deference. There's a feeling of civility, a humbling before another that is just always expected when you encounter the police in an official capacity. And it's not difficult to imagine how easily an encounter with the police can go wrong. On one hand, too much pride. I felt need to stand on principle, maybe a little back-talking, not responding quickly enough, feeling already angry and showing that anger to an officer. Resentment if you feel like you've been repeatedly picked on. On the other side, You can have a police officer who's feeling tired or cross or resentful or angry or afraid or just having a really bad day. An officer who hasn't been properly trained or is new to the job, or an officer who's perhaps been doing the job for too long and has lost a feel for the work. An officer whose judgment is colored by prejudice. The list goes on, and the consequences, as we know too well, can be terrible. It doesn't take much for something to go wrong and for a situation to escalate, sometimes in just a matter of seconds. Race compounds the complexity of such encounters. I often wonder what might have happened to me as a young adult if I were black. There were a few incidents. Again, I'm not going to talk about them. When I was a teenager, that could have easily turned tragic if the officer had thought of me as a threat or a criminal. There are a lot of disadvantages to being Asian American, but the perception that one is somehow prone to violence and criminality is not one of them. So I can only relate sympathetically to young African Americans, both male and female, when they talk about their experiences with the police. And what I am certain of is that if a civilian might have all sorts of fantastic ideas about what life as a police officer is like from watching TV and watching movies and reading books, so too will an officer harbor fantastic ideas about civilians from the same sources, especially if those civilians are black. No one's sense of reality is unmediated or perfect. Everyone lives in a blur of fantasy and reality. Also, when we add racial difference into an encounter with the police, we can't avoid bringing along the even greater complexity of history and the inequalities that history have put into motion, and that's what the previous speakers have really hit on, I think. Obviously, we can't go into detail about these larger and important historical and social contexts, but I do want to just showcase a few of them to highlight how important they are at the risk of maybe repeating what others have said. First, we are living in a time of incredible income and wealth inequality. This is a fact that no credible person will disagree with. Simultaneously, public support for important civic institutions have been on the wane for several decades. There has been a steady withdrawal of funding for welfare programs, mental and public health institutions, and educations, to name just a few areas where this has happened. What was once pervasive has now been shut down or shrunk. What the combination of these two phenomena means in terms of actual lived lives is that there's a substantial and growing population of people, many of whom are people of color, who have fallen into deep poverty and who have much fewer resources to turn to when they are in need. The stress of these circumstances on such people are terrible and manifest in all sorts of predictably unhealthy ways. Even for members of a professional and managerial class, like myself, our lives have become more precarious, and risks are harder to take because there are now so few social safety nets left. One consequence of this evolving dynamic has been that the police have been asked to carry out duties that they are not trained for. They are asked to be social workers, staff psychologists, educators, conflict resolvers. They have to negotiate a wide range of complex interpersonal relations and problems. We shouldn't be surprised if they're not always good at these jobs, since they haven't been trained to do them. And certainly in many such cases, the expectations officers have that they will be treated with deference fails to be met. They often have to endure a lot of verbal abuse. We compound such problems with the demand for more intensive policing, preemptive stop and frisk, no broken windows, expectations about the number of tickets and arrests made to demonstrate effectiveness. The police are being asked to enforce theories that are at best not thought through very carefully and are proving in practice hard to support. What results is a low-intensity, ever-pervasive pressure on people of color, especially the young and the poor, who are overtly told that they are viewed as potential criminals. We're also living in a time when demographics are in flux in all sorts of destabilizing ways. We know that in a few decades, the country will no longer be majority white. We know that some places, especially on the coasts, this is already true. But we also have to keep in mind that gentrification has driven former residents, many of them poor people of color, out of our city centers and into the inner ring of older suburbs. And it's no mistake that Ferguson, a suburb of St. Louis, was where the recent unrest has begun. Once majority white, it is now majority African American. That means that while its government and its police force remain largely white, who is governed and policed are not. Populations who have been defined by their social distance from one another are now being thrown into haphazard intimacy. Those in positions of power in these communities are not nearly as diverse as the residents now are, and it would be easy for them to equate a declining tax base and weakening property values to the diversification of their population, a prejudicial attitude that can easily exacerbate already combustible situations. I'm going to conclude now. Thank you for listening to me. It seems to me that Black Lives Matter is an important social and political movement that is not only about police brutality and the lack of accountability, though those are important issues. It is also a movement that seeks to shed light on how we have reached our current impasse in terms of race and class. It questions business as usual, which increasingly appears unsustainable to more and more people in all sorts of troubling ways, shedding light in the process not on immediate causes, but on structural issues that are too often easily unseen. It is finally a movement that is not isolated, but part of a larger dissatisfaction with the present that keeps finding expression in all sorts of unexpected ways. It's possible to imagine that some reforms will be instituted in terms of how the police interact with the public, and that these reforms will lessen the current tensions. But such reforms are unlikely to shore up an edifice that is sprouting more and more leaks. Thank you.
So I have to move to the podium because I have just a handful of slides to share as part of my presentation. Many of my remarks will actually follow on Dean Rougeau's and Professor Song's. I'm a historian, and historians really love to fetishize anniversaries. And for those of us who are interested in race in the U.S. and African American history, 2015 really provides a lot of ample opportunity to recognize some very key anniversaries. When we think about 150th anniversary of the abolition of slavery with the ratification of the 13th Amendment in December of 1865, or the assassination of Malcolm X, which actually will have occurred just a month from today, 50 years ago. But there are three anniversaries that I think are very important in helping me think about race in the United States in 2015. And one of them has been receiving a great deal of coverage recently with the release of the movie Selma. And that is the 50th anniversary of the march from Selma to Montgomery and the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which was actually the culmination of years, if not decades, of work by activists, including Fannie Lou Hamer and the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which challenged the legitimacy of the all-white Mississippi delegation at the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City in 1964, or the heroic efforts of black and white college students who descended upon Mississippi in the summer of 1964 to register rural black Alabamans, and many of whom or some of whom paid with their lives, including the 3 civil rights workers who were killed in Philadelphia, Mississippi. But this image is an image of the march from Selma to Montgomery, which, if you've seen the movie, you know nonviolent protesters were met with incredible amounts of violence by the local police as well as the sheriff and state police. And that really galvanized the American public and Lyndon B. Johnson and sympathetic congressmen to actually work towards creating or drafting legislation and passing the voting, what ended up being the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which did away with literacy qualifications. And as a result, you see a tremendous increase of the number of black Southerners who are registered to vote. Just give you one example, in 1965, or 1964, I should say, only 6% of black Mississippians were registered to vote. By 2004, 76% of black Mississippians were registered to vote, and that actually outstripped the number of white Mississippians who are registered to vote at 72%. But interestingly enough, it was the very success of this legislation that provided the rationale for the majority of the Supreme Court in 2013 to actually invalidate a key provision in the Voting Rights Act, which required 9 states that had a history of disfranchising African Americans from and Latinos. That key provision required those states to actually obtain pre-clearance from the federal government before changing their election laws. Now, Shelby County versus Holder, which was decided in 2013, if it didn't pave the way, it certainly removed the obstacles to many states beginning to change their election laws, include states like North Carolina and Texas, which passed laws that would require photo IDs to vote, right? Eliminated same-day registration, cut back on early voting. Now, it's too soon to say if these laws have a suppressive effect and if they disproportionately affect blacks and Hispanics, but other efforts were clearly aimed at suppressing the black vote, including, some of you may have heard, just as recently as a few months before this most recent midterm elections, billboards going up in black neighborhoods in Cleveland and Milwaukee warning those communities that voter fraud is a felony. Right? Now, in the absence of evidence that widespread voting fraud exists, one can only surmise that these tactics are meant to reduce the size of the electorate, to make voting more difficult. So whereas I agree we have to be very vigilant about exercising our right to the franchise, we also have to be very vigilant about, and we shouldn't fool ourselves that these laws are actually part of a larger racial backlash, right? And we're talking about suppressing a particular segment of the electorate. So what does this mean for communities of color that are trying or should be trying to elect leadership that is reflective of the community itself? And I'm thinking here again about Ferguson, as Professor Song just reminded us, is characterized by a gulf, a chasm between the demographics of the community and the demographics of community leadership. And this in no small way is responsible for the escalation of hostility between the police and community residents and the failure on the part of the municipal leaders to address the concerns of African Americans in the wake of the killing of Michael Brown in August of 2014. Now, at one point, in the aftermath of Ferguson, but before the decision to not indict Officer Darren Wilson was announced, I thought that police brutality and unequal policing would ultimately have to be addressed at the local level. That is, improving community policing, requiring police officers to wear body cameras, strengthening civilian oversight of police, and so forth. I've increasingly come to see this as a problem and a crisis that requires a more global approach. And this brings me to the second anniversary that I want to briefly talk about. This year marks the 100th anniversary of the release of The Birth of a Nation, D.W. Griffith's cinematic masterpiece, which basically advanced a white supremacist narrative of the Civil War and Reconstruction, right, in which the federal government, which was run by radical Republicans, imposed black rule on the South. And 10 years of misrule ensued because of African Americans' incapacity for self-government, let alone their ability to govern society. So this narrative, this film advanced a narrative in which Reconstruction was not a period of progress for African Americans, but rather a regression in which whites were subordinated only to be liberated by the Ku Klux Klan. And the Ku Klux Klan was reborn in 1915 after having been driven underground in the early 1870s. Another interesting aspect of this film was that it put into circulation, cinematic circulation, a particular representation of blackness, in which the exemplar of the recently liberated slave, this individual named Gus, who after being released from slavery, joins the Union Army and becomes an officer and essentially mistakes his newfound freedom and political power as a license to lord over whites, okay, including gaining sexual access to white women. And so his attempt at the end, or towards the end of the movie, to rape Lucy Cameron, the sister of Colonel Ben Cameron, who's the personification of the defeated and aggrieved white Southerner, really again solidifies in the public imaginary this representation of the black beast rapist, which is part of a much longer history of the criminalization of African Americans. We can go back to the colonial period, but just within the last 150 years, we have to look at the debt peonage and the convict lease system that emerges after emancipation, as well as mass incarceration in the post-industrial period. So, I mean, we're really dealing with a culture that criminalizes, that continues to criminalize black people in particular. And this, to borrow from Aimé Césaire, who's talking about this within the context of colonialism, there's a thingification of black people, which we saw with the way that Officer Wilson talked about Michael Brown. So how do we address this as a society? I think one of the things that Professor Song was talking about, the importance of investing in communities of color, poor communities in terms of education, jobs, social services. But I think also, and this is to bring it back from the global to the local, we have to talk about the importance of creating more diverse institutions. And I think that we as a BC community need to ask ourselves, are we doing enough as an institution to ensure that the majority population, that is whites, are being educated in an environment that disrupts the tendency to see blacks or people of color, or blacks and Latinos anyway, as more apt to commit crimes, not interested in education, and undeserving of their space in institutions of higher education. As an institution, we need to do much better in creating a more racially diverse student body, and certainly a more racially diverse faculty. Which brings me back to my last anniversary that I want to just, I guess, not that he needs it, but I'll redeem. Lyndon B. Johnson. If you all haven't been following the controversy around Selma, that won't mean anything to you. But we're talking about the 50th anniversary of Lyndon B. Johnson's speech at Howard University in June of 1965, just a few months after he delivers his speech calling for the passage of voting rights legislation, in which he clearly pointed out that the civil rights movement should not end. Black freedom could not end with, or wasn't solely, I should say, the right to vote and the right to go into a restaurant or a store, but rather that the Black freedom struggle needed to continue in terms of making sure that society gave African Americans the resources to be successful. Right? And so in this speech in which he says the equality of results, not merely the equality of opportunity, should be the marker by which the success of the Black freedom struggle should be measured. And so this was reflective of LBJ's larger campaign to end poverty, but it also laid the groundwork for more aggressive policies and opening up opportunities for people of color, including affirmative action. And so in the face of continued assaults on affirmative action, my hope for 2015 is that we engage in discussions about how to achieve a more diverse and equitable environment at all levels in the university, again, not only in terms of student body, in terms of faculty, as well as administration. And my other hope is also that we begin to listen to all students, and especially students of color, about their experiences and feelings about BC. Thank you.
So I ask Harrison and Gaitan. They'll have microphones. We have about 20, 25 minutes for questions and comments, and the floor is now open. Harrison?
So I want to thank the panel for being here. This is a great, fantastic. As we tackle these difficult issues, I think it's really important, this might be a comment, more of a question, but I'll try to make it into a question. Where do we see the leadership at this university when this event, for example, is sponsored by the Jesuit Institute, by the Dean of Faculties, but not by the President's office? And we haven't heard anything from the President about what's happened on campus and about what's happened in our country. And so how can we continue on this path of talking about diversity and inclusion and communities and developing communities of color without leadership from the top?
The only thing I can say is that I called up David and said, let's have this. So, I mean, that's the only thing I can say that I know along that, not to in any way comment on your question, but just to say how I'm here and how David's here and how they're here.
I won't say anything about why the president isn't here or his office sponsoring this event, but I wanted to say that BC is not the president's office. It's an institution that's made up of everyone in this room. And I think what's important is that we are here.
And I would add, maybe we sometimes should resist the tendency, although I think it's a natural one, to think in such hierarchical terms, because traditionally a university is a creature of its academic life. And I think what you're seeing is a real commitment by those of us who are, deeply immersed and in charge of the academic mission of the university, stepping forward and doing what we think needs to be done. I mean, we don't ask for permission. We do what we think we have to do. And, the president's office, I'm sure, will respond in its time. But I guess we should celebrate the fact that I think as academics, leaders, as faculty, as students, we're here. And, the conversation is moving.
I would just say I agree with that, and I'm thankful that the Provost's office and the Jesuit Institute has organized this event. But I also think that there's just something important. I don't so much think that the president's office needs to lead, the discussions that we're having, right? But I do think that at a minimum there needs to be some acknowledgement that the events of the past few months have deeply affected a significant segment of the community here, and I'd love to hear from some other students about what it means for them that the president isn't actually coming out with any statement.
Yes, in the back, Gaitan, can you get there? What?
I'm the great-grandson of American slaves. My great-grandparents were American slaves. Number one. Number two, I am Boston College's first tenured African-American professor. I came here in 1968. I met with Father Donovan, and we consummated a contract somewhere there in January or February of '68. I'm sorry, yes. And there are two things that I want to say, which I think the audience needs to have a feeling for. I think blacks know it, folks of color know it, but not sure those who are white know it or understand it. We of color live under horrendous fear. Horrendous fear. Let me give you an example. If we're driving down the street and we see a police car over there, all of us see it, notice it, and keep driving. But tell you, if you are a black person, you keep looking at that rearview mirror to see whether or not that cop was following you. Even after you turn the corner, you look at that rearview mirror. Whites don't live under that fear. And what I have found, I've been on 6 continents of this earth. South America is the only one I haven't been on. And that's only because there are no people living there. It's just a research station. That other people of color do not live under the kind of fear that we do. I've been on various countries. I've lived under British control, British colonial control, lived under French colonial control, Nigeria, Jamaica, French Cameroons. So I'm just trying to say that whites do not understand the kind of fear that we live under. Okay, that's it. What should happen, or what needs to happen? I have yet to find a black student who graduated from Boston College, my 2 children did also, who would say, I learned how to live with racism. We graduate them with all the academic knowledge they need, but we don't prepare them to deal with racism. We send them out with their degree, and they get into the workplace, and then they have to deal with racism. And they don't know, is it them or is it the system? All that I'm trying to say is that this is a different world than what it was when I came here. This is a different world. And talking about radicalizing, well, the life that we live can radicalize people to a degree. So what should happen? We should have more than discussions. If this is only going to be discussion, well, we'll have another 50 years to be just like this. There must be an action plan to move to take care of things, to move to integrate and make us a part of here. I'm sorry to take up that much time, but I'm sharing with you. I've been all over, you name the country I've been there, and I've seen racism under the British, under the French, down in Australia. It's not like racism here. It is not. And when you have folks who are of color who come to this country where there has been race, they don't understand what's going on in this country. Thank you very much.
Any other? Yes, right here. Gaitan, you've got, he's right here. Thank you.
Thank you for the great discussion about race. I wasn't going to say anything, but after the last comment, I have to say something. Why every meeting I go to about race, it winds up being about black and white? It always comes out to that. Hispanics in this country are 40 million people. We put the last president into office. Yet every meeting comes down about celebrating the great achievements of Martin Luther King, I don't hear anything about Hispanics. I don't hear anything about Cesar Chavez. I don't hear anything. Lyndon Johnson, we're talking about Lyndon Johnson, the great achievements he did for civil rights. Yes, he did so much for Hispanics in Texas, yet they're not discussed. White is always turns into black and white. White, we don't speak about Mexican Americans, Salvadorans, Dominicans, Puerto Ricans, Asians. Why is always, they're always left out. Thank you.
Because this country's built on passing. All the groups, the immigrant groups who came here were passing. They changed your last name so that it wouldn't look like where you came from. Drop the vowels after it. It's passing. But there's no passing that folks looking like me can do.
I just realized that, in the beginning, we were hoping that students would be saying something, and we've already gone for 10 minutes, and I'm going to use the prerogative here. Are there any students with comments or questions that you would like to raise? Okay, right, there's two in the back. So, yeah, Gaetan, it's yours. It's your side. There's two. There's a woman there and with a black blouse, and then that fellow.
Hello, thank you for speaking and coming to talk about this and starting the dialogue. My question is about, we always talk about an action plan and doing something, but with something that's such an internally rooted issue, how do we externally create an action plan?
So,
What do you mean by internally? What do you mean by internal?
I think racism kind of stems from stereotypes and people having beliefs about something. So it's a belief system that is outwardly expressed and creates racism. So if it's starting from inside, how do you deal with it on an external level?
Well, I never thought I'd do this, but I'm actually going to quote Police Chief William Bratton, the NYPD, and I think it was the first officer's funeral where he delivered some remarks, and he talked about the importance of us seeing each other, right? Really, really seeing each other. And I think that kind of speaks to that. But how do you really see each other if you're in an environment in which, in a basically homogenous environment, right? Where the images that you see of the other are the kind of images that Professor Song was talking about, which is why I ended my comments by talking about the importance. And I'm just not talking about BC, I'm talking about higher education, I'm talking about all of our institutions. We're moving towards a knowledge economy, right? I mean, we're already in a knowledge economy, but in all of, you've been hearing about Silicon Valley is how white it is, right? And so that's an institution, and it's not diverse, it's not reflective of our society. So I think we really have to be aggressive about diversifying all of our institutions in this country. And if I could just really briefly say, I don't think that it just comes down to black and white. I mean, there are a number of people on this panel who were talking about how our problem with race extends well beyond just the black-white issue. And so, certainly, we can talk about the existence of Latino Heritage Month here at PC. I mean, I don't think it always comes down to black and white.
Nancy?
Yeah, I want to remark on that as well. I think that's very true. I don't think it's simply a black-white issue. I think we are still at a place of coming into and growing into our ability to think about race in a much more complex way, as you mentioned, and we need to do that. And it's still a process that we're maturing into. But I think it's clearly not, and certainly my remarks were intended to provoke and to put forward the context of Mexican Americans and the borderland and how that shapes the whole racial landscape here. And also to the question of how change happens. I think this notion that I mentioned about the inner journey and looking at the places in our own lives where we feel uncomfortable or where we have been aware of questions of race and they start to stimulate something inside of us internally. I think we have to hit the pause button on those experiences and take some time to really reflect ourselves on what is going on. It's the place where I think we can then begin to look at some of the external manifestations of our own prejudices and biases and push them to a different place. But we can't do that if we don't know ourselves and our own experience in diverse situations. And some of us come from contexts where we've been pretty much in a homogenous experience, and so we're not always in touch with it. So I would just encourage us to think about our own journeys with that.
Okay, just 1 minute, and then there's a woman back there. She's been waiting for 15 minutes
I want to say
to speak.
something very quickly, and that is, I guess, I kind of disagree with the way we talk about race as something that is internal, that comes from seeing each other properly. It tends to revolve again around the individual. It's about how we really feel. It becomes a matter of personal responsibility. And from my perspective, you know, if you stay at that level, you'll never systematically change the way race is structured in this country. You know, in many ways, race is really about the kind of institutional structures that have been historically put into place that shapes the very kind of interactions we have with each other and in fact shapes how we imagine ourselves. And if we want change, it doesn't happen on the individual level, it happens on the structural level. And how structural change happens is through collective action, not individual action.
So, Gaitan, do you see her? There, good. Excellent.
Hi, my name is Ashley Pruitt. I'm a senior here, and I just wanted to briefly speak on my experience. And for the students who are not of color in this room, we all know what it is to be a BC student, to feel that pressure to not only do well academically, but to be involved socially on campus. But imagine that experience and that pressure being compounded by the pressures of racial injustice that are not only going on around us in this country, but on our very own campus. So as everything was happening in Ferguson and Staten Island, there were days when I didn't want to get out of bed because I was so hurt and discouraged by the things that were happening. And I have a number of peers that stand by me and feel the same hurt that I feel, and even allies that have been standing behind us and beside us as well. And I just want to challenge you all to stop being comfortable. Talking about race is not easy, and it's never going to be. And I feel like there's so much silence on this campus surrounding this issue because people want to stay comfortable. But if you want there to be equality, if you want to live in a world of justice, you're going to have to step out of your comfort zone and acquire some empathy for the issues that are going on with people that are right next to you. So I just want to challenge you all to educate yourselves, and even on a basic level, ask a person of color on this campus what their experience is like. And if you don't feel like you know anybody you can ask, then that's already a problem. And you can make plenty of connections in this room right now. My name is Ashley again, so feel free to come talk to me or a number of my peers that are here and are open and willing to talk to you about our experience and also how you can come together with us to make a difference on this campus, because we are working collectively right now in order to do that.
Terrific. Okay, yes, over here. And why don't you go there? Harrison, get over there.
Hello, my name is Quasi. I'm a junior. I kind of wanted to address the whole issue with Father Leahy and the higher-ups at Boston College. I feel like there are a bunch of conflicting messages because on the one hand we say, you know, these things don't just work on an individual level. We have to, work on an institutional level. And here we are at a powerful institution with a huge endowment, with a huge reach. 30,000 people apply here every year, and yet we don't feel that the administration has a responsibility. As Jesuits, they don't have a responsibility. As human beings, they don't have a responsibility, because at the end of the day, people of color, whether they're Boston College students or not, experience to varying degrees all the things that we discuss, in an intellectual sense. We show the slides and, all that sort of thing. But, when I look at the news, I'm not seeing this as, some socioeconomic issue, some socio-political issue. I'm seeing what could be my very near future. I'm seeing what could be my, family members' very near future. And, when you consider it on that level, when you allow emotion and those sorts of things to get involved, then responsibility becomes more of a universal thing. And Father Leahy no longer seems to be this, you can't put it on him, he's not the face of the university. But, he is one of the faces. I'm not the face of the university. Because, there's a lot of complaints that the students here are not very active, but I say that the students are very active and involved. And, when we've been involved in ways that, might not be safe, or, might not be, an image, or, something that is, universally appealing, or something that Taylor Swift might retweet and be interested in, all of a sudden, rules become very important, But I feel that the university has failed me personally, has failed a lot of my classmates personally, because at the end of the day, if I don't get, some sort of reciprocation, some sort of, acknowledgement that my life matters, that Black lives matter, I feel like a fool, I march around campus with my friends, and, we feel like, what are we doing this for? Do they hear us? That's it.
Anyone else? Yes.
Hi, my name's Mary Yangert. I'm a junior, and my question is it's to the panel, but in response to Ashley's statements, which I thought were great. And my question is just, as a white person who has benefited from the racial injustices that in a society that white people have built over time, how do we be good allies? How do we join the fight in a situation where it's clear, I can't empathize with a Black person. I've never been treated unjustly because of my race. So I guess the question is, how does a white person, or how do we as white people responsibly join the fight without trying to, really, there's a difference between understanding what a Black or an African American is going through and trying to say that you really understand the heart of the issue, because I know that I don't. I've never been through it. So I guess, how do we do that?
I would like to say that's a question not only for the panel, but for students. If some student would like to reply with more than, he wants to reply, right there. Harrison, get it to him. I think this is a time when students should be having more of a say.
I'm Alex. I want to respond to that by saying educating yourself and empathizing as much as you possibly can is the first step. If you have friends, I don't know, based on my experience this first year, when the Ferguson verdict was given and I saw the protests rolling by, I walked and joined, and my white friend was standing right next to me, and he stood next to me the entire time. And just that meant a lot, and I know that he stands with me on these issues and as a friend, and just if I asked him to be part of some greater movement and to respect me as a person, his standing there demonstrates that. And if you stand with us on these issues, that's the biggest thing you can do. So that's it.
have somebody here. Oh.
Sorry, just to elaborate on that, while everybody in this room, is being educated on these issues and is, being helpful, being a part of this community that's trying to bring African Americans forward, there are a lot of people on this campus who don't even acknowledge that, there is a problem. And one of the issues I face is when I want to try to enlighten, I don't want to say enlighten people, when I want to try to bring light to the issue to people who may or may not understand what we're going through as a people, I feel like, it's just another black person talking about black oppression. And I feel like the best way for our white friends, our white allies to help us is by just being another voice, because our voice is strong, but with your voice, we can be even stronger. So.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sean. I'm a senior here. I want to respond to your question, too. I'm basically just going to echo a lot of what you were saying. But as a white person, basically the best way that you can be an ally is first and foremost is to educate yourself. Something that you did just in asking your question was recognizing your privilege, which is super important as well. Another thing that's super important is continuing the conversation. Something brought all of you into this room. It could have just been you had to come for class. But even if that's it, it's still something and you still are here. Take that with you when you leave. And, talk to your other friends. It's really important that, you don't just have these conversations when, you're in this type of setting. You need to be having it in a lot of other settings. And my last quick comment is something that's really important as a white ally is to follow black leadership in movements. And especially in the movements that so many awesome students on our campus have started. And just, like they were saying, just standing next to them. It's really important and means more than you can think. And, and don't be afraid. No one knows everything. I don't know everything. But it's just asking the right questions and, just thinking about it is something that's really important to do.
Thank you. Gaitan, there's a question right here. Comment? Well, she's for, and then you, okay? She's been here. Nobody's seen her except for me. Now she has the mic.
Hi, I'm Ernestina. I am from New York City. I went to high school. I was 51% Asian, and I loved it. Not because I was the majority, but because I was surrounded by so much diversity. And it was very interesting to come to BC, where collectively the minorities were almost 30% of the school. And my roommate, right, I was blessed to have her as a roommate. She was great. But this was the most diverse place that she'd ever been in her life. And I think, for a lot of us, especially minorities, we forget that a lot of people have different experiences. And a lot of people, this is the biggest education that they've had on race so far. And for sure, it's not enough. And I think for me, it's almost like we need to be forced to be educated. So I'm a theology major and a finance major. And one of my theology classes, outside of teaching me, the history of the Bible, really teaches me things about my personal faith and my experiences, right? So there's things that are personally applicable. And I think there's a place for the university and a place for the school to require classes to have a better cultural diversity core that really helps you really go through your experiences and really talk about the experiences that other people have. So in a way, force is never a word that we like to use, but you're forced to learn about things that you didn't ever want to experience or think you want to experience, but really are a necessary part of your education as an individual, one in higher education, but also leaving BC and being a part of a world that, wants to collectively change a system that at times doesn't want to change as fast as it should. So I think there's a lot that the school in terms of classes can do.
Thank you.
Hi, guys. I'm Meg. I'm a senior, and I think this is such an important conversation to be having, and I really appreciate the effort to have students respond a little bit, because I think that is a big part of where the conversation really takes on a life of its own as we enter these situations and learn how to be adults in a culture where a lot of us are encountering people and ways of living that we have not seen before. And I think to respond to your question earlier, a huge part of that is for white students having these conversations in places where it's not easy to have them, because it's easy to go into a sociology class on race and talk about race. It's easy to talk with your friends in Faces about race, but it's not easy to go into your friend's mod necessarily, who's, grew up in a very privileged society and doesn't see race as an issue, and talk about that. And those are the places I think where, there's a lot of people that are not in this room right now, and some of them couldn't come and some of them didn't want to come. And I think those really difficult conversations for white students, like you said, it's tough to come in as a student of color and not be seen as, oh, classic, But when someone says, oh, that's a person coming from the exact same place, race-wise, culturally, economically, whatever it is that I am from, and they're thinking differently about it than I am, I think that is where people start to question their own assumptions, and I think that's a really, really important role that's sometimes overlooked. And that's, of course, in addition to all the other things that were mentioned before, like university level, educating yourself, et cetera. But I just wanted to challenge my fellow white students to really have those conversations in difficult places.
We're approaching 100 minutes, and so I'd like to say are there 2 or 3 final comments, and then do a closing. The heat of the room alone. Hagop is in the back. Could somebody get to him?
Hi, my name's Hagop. I'm a sophomore. And I'd just like to say something I think important about the way we approach trying to get Father Leahy and the leadership of the university to act or to say something on this issue. I was at a mass on Sunday night, and I'm sure many of you also were there, led by Father Leahy, and present were more than a dozen Jesuits, and a wonderful sermon was given by Father Michael Davidson, a great Jesuit from Jamaica, who said, essentially a lot of what's been said here. He said how we have a responsibility to step well beyond our comfort zones. We have a responsibility to fight for justice, and that's something that we need to take very seriously. And it's a sermon that Father Leahy thanked him more than once for and was visibly moved by. So I think it's a very valid sentiment for people to say that perhaps he hasn't been as active as they would like, that he hasn't been as loud a voice as they would like. But I do think it's very important to note that in trying to get him to be a strong advocate, I think the way to approach him, we should keep in mind where his heart might be, and I think evidence of where that heart was at that Mass.
Yes, right there. Harrison, turn around. That man, and then...
Hi, everyone. My name is David Corby. I'm a senior. And I'm going to be completely honest. If you want to be an ally, you just got to acknowledge your racism. Acknowledge it and get over it. Because we all have racist tendencies. I mean, as an African-American male, I've been socialized in the system too. And I feel like I've learned to disrespect my own people, just look the other way, feel as though I'm in danger from somebody who looks similar to me. And I think that as a white person coming into this, you feel like there's white guilt. You feel like you're going to get bashed because you're white, because of racism, or because of slavery. Like, honestly, we're moving forward. This is a progressive future. And all you have to do is acknowledge it. Because I acknowledge my own racism. And I think that if you want to gain allies in this, you just have to acknowledge your own racism and then be able to move on from it. So.
All right, these 2 are the final comments. Harrison, you're good. Gaitan, there. Here, Gaitan's coming to you. There he is. And then, if you could just be, both of you, brief so that we can close.
Hi, I'm Carla Nicholas. I'm a freshman, and I just want to make one small point because I felt like it wasn't really touched on. I feel like when we talk about race, we really go towards the stereotype of like the black man. And I just wanted to also point out like the stereotypes that come behind the black woman. And it's kind of like we have a double, not standard, but I guess a double attack on us, because not only do we have this race problem behind us and here in America, but also, the glass ceiling of the woman. And so I just want that to be something to be on your minds as you walk out of this room, just for the future reference. Whenever you talk to one of your own friends, maybe like talk to them about that and see what they think about that. And you can also talk to me.
And this is the last comment, other than mine.
Really, it's just a question for the panel. I'm Lily Disher. I'm a junior. We talk about how in the next few decades, the minorities will be the majority. And we also talk about how racism is a system and a structure. I'm really just curious, moving forward, looking at America will look a lot different. Our children and generations ahead, we won't look the same that we do now. There will be a lot more interracial couples and multiracial people, biracial people. How do we prevent the system from being as pervasive as it is now moving forward? Racism can be applied to anyone. How do we prevent that as a country, once we get outside black and white?
I'd like to exercise the prerogative of saying that was a comment rather than a question, and it's going to remain a question, I think, that we need to address at the next time we gather. I want to just close on this. Myself, 6 years ago, I was approached by one of my doctoral students. Her name is Katie Grimes. She's now teaching at Villanova. She wanted to do her dissertation on race, and she wanted to do it on white supremacy as being a more appropriate, rather than white privilege, term of analysis for looking at church life in the United States. She was debating between working with me, because I have good direction, good mentoring skills, and Sean Copeland, who had competency. But she didn't know who to work with. So finally I went to Sean. I'm good friends with Sean. Sean is an African-American theologian. I went to her and I said, Sean, Katie wants to do her doctorate on white supremacy, and she's debating between working with me or working with you. And then Sean told me, this is 6 years ago, she said, it would be nice if somebody in the ethics area, my area, directed this dissertation. It would be nice if some ethicist directed a dissertation on race. You do it. So I did. That's how I'm here. Each of us find ourselves encountered by one another. I think the best part of this evening has been when students were responding to one another, of creatively addressing the issues of how do we better understand one another. But it is by invitation. It's by taking advantage, as Sean did, of engaging me and telling me I had to know much more about race. And that's been a journey that started years ago, but it had a real key moment for me 6 years ago. I think it's important for students to ask their faculty. I mean, you're asking about Father Leahy. It's important to ask your faculty about these questions about race. We have to engage the faculty more creatively. We have to, more directly, to be able to look at what are the challenges that our students have in everyday life. And while you're doing it, you may just not want to bring up race. You may want to bring up class. Thank you.